I'm going to start by going through a little bit of the odyssey that's brought me here, because some of the facts of what I went through are sort of essential to understanding the lessons I'm talking about. So basically, I'm going to talk about how I went from this to almost this, and what the path there was. At least that's where I'm trying to get. So first of all, a bit of background. This picture here is probably the only time in the whole 1970s that I wore a tie. And you can probably see the disguise was incomplete. So I was not exactly pursuing a career in business. I was majoring in religious studies and mathematics. And I went into computer science because I thought it would be interesting to see, as artificial intelligence developed, whether those machines made the same claim to a soul as human beings do. You know, obviously, that was ridiculous because none of that happened. But I happened to show up in 1980 at Carnegie Mellon University and was immediately introduced to this amazing network called the ARPANET that had over 100 machines on it. One of them as far away as England. And all sorts of cool things were going on. And I ended up spending the rest of my career working on this technology. Now, when I was a grad student, I started my first company. This was called Cellars. And this was probably before most of you were born, or your parents met. This was when machines like the VIC-20 came out, or the TI-99-4A. These were machines that hooked up to your TV and to a cassette drive and stored all their data on cassette. And you wouldn't believe how long it took to find something on the cassette. But these were the first home computers that anyone could really afford, you know, that wasn't pretty affluent. And so I got together with my wife and a couple of friends and decided that for the home, what we should build is a system of games and other applications that use a database system that we would build for this low-powered new machine. So we were trying to be the first to do stuff like that. It didn't work. I'll come back to why. The second thing I founded was several years later, after the MIME work. I founded a company called First Virtual Holdings. This was the first internet payment system. Think of it as PayPal before there was anybody who wanted to use PayPal, which tells you a little bit about one lesson right there. But we did go through quite a ride. We had an IPO in 1996. I became a multimillionaire for a little over 2 years, and then I lost it all. So it was an interesting ride. The next company I co-founded, it's called netpos.com. It's still alive, an Ann Arbor-based company, and in fact, 3 of the people are in the back of the room right now trying to look inconspicuous. This was a system that provides point-of-sale service to restaurants. So the idea here is that the previous generation of technology, each store would have its own server in the back room, and somebody had to be a system administrator for each store, which didn't work very well in terms of backups and centralized information and so on. And with this model, all the information showed up at a central site almost instantly. It's a cloud model, allowing much tighter chain management of what was going on, at least in theory. And then the fourth and last company that taught me these lessons is Mimecast, where I am now. I'm not a founder of this one like the other 3. I joined this one 3 years ago when it had 100 people, and I was looking to join a company that would go from there to much bigger, because that was something I'd never experienced. I'd experienced small companies and big companies, but not the in-between. Now it's 600 people, so it seems to be well on its way. There's probably an IPO in the not-too-distant future. I might even be rich again. And what we do is we provide unified email management in the cloud. And what this means is basically everything that companies want around their email besides the basic email service. Things like security, compliance with various regulations, continuity over system outages, and most of all, archiving. And obviously, it's pretty successful since we're on every continent now except Antarctica, and continuing to grow. And then there will also be some lessons along the way here that I learned at these other places. The first 4 I spent some time at. I was at IBM for 8 years. I was a faculty member here for, I think, 4 years. And they were great years. And it was the School of Information. So I just have to give a shout out to how happy I am to be back here and share a cartoon I saw yesterday about what it means to be the School of Information. You may not know this, but when they first changed the name of the school to the School of Information, for a while people kept showing up at the main office and asking for directions and stuff like that. I don't know if they do that anymore. I hope not. Okay, so the lessons, hopefully the good part. So the first lesson is to think really hard about where your market is and whether there is a market at all. You can easily make guesses. And those guesses, if you only check them with your partners or other people who are sympathetic and enthusiastic, you're in an echo chamber. It's like only watching Fox News, pardon me. You need to get more diverse opinions. So we were building all these ambitious systems for home computers that, as it turns out, never really took off. The computers in that era were much cheaper than the IBM PC, but they were so underpowered that it basically stagnated until the PC got to be cheap enough for people to use that. So the only difference between soft Cellars and our larger competitors who tried to get into this space is they lost more money than we did because they had more. But illustrating that is the fact that at this point in time, it was just starting to be an idea that consumers might buy software. And nobody knew quite what that meant. There wasn't really a net for most people. And so you'd have to buy a physical object. By the way, I mentioned the NetPOS people in the room. Now we've got a first virtual person in the room. So Kmart in particular was the 800-pound gorilla at the time. And our holy grail was to get our software into Kmart. And we worked and worked and worked at that. And a few companies actually did get their software into Kmart. But Kmart made a corporate decision that when you marketed software, it had to look like the thing on the right. It had to be on a hanger with a label that you could see and a cassette or disc or whatever inside. That's how you sell software. And it took us a long time to figure that out because they were still figuring it out. So the fact that nobody knew how to sell this kind of software should have been a tip-off that there wasn't a market for this kind of software. But we were only listening to each other. You should expect to fail. Victor already talked about this a bit, and I certainly agree. Even the most successful ventures tend to have some failures along the way. Some obvious examples, the Apple I was not much of a success. The Apple II was hugely successful. Then they built their first attempt at a graphical computer. It was the Lisa. It was not successful. Then came the Macintosh. In each of these cases, the fact of the failure didn't convince people necessarily that what they were doing was a bad idea. Now, it might have been, like soft Cellars. We could have kept trying and trying and trying, and nothing would have worked because there was no market. So it's important to try to understand why you failed. But the fact that you're going to fail is almost a dead certainty. I only know of one or two people who just jumped in, founded a company, became multimillionaires. And the only one who comes to mind was an incredibly unethical person, but more about that later. The next is work with the right people. And pardon me, I just remembered that I wanted to be following along with my own notes during this, just not to miss a couple things. If you can't find a set of people that flesh out your team that feel like people who have your back and that you're going to enjoy doing business with, if you keep trying and you absolutely can't find them, give up. Because if you have the wrong people in your team, it's incredibly unlikely that it'll work. And even if it does, it's incredibly unlikely that you'll enjoy it. These people basically become your family when you're in a startup. And certain kinds of bad people are absolutely toxic. At First Virtual, we had an interesting example of this. First Virtual was founded on the birth of a friendship. When my partner, Lee Stein, and I first met, it was just this instant clicking. It was like falling in love, although without the touching. And sort of the whole company grew out of a desire to take advantage of this newly available commercial internet. and turned into the payment system and all that. And we had two other partners we quickly brought in who we were equally in sync with, equally close to. Later on, in the first virtual days, as we were approaching our IPO, we hired someone. There's a highly technical term in the stock market called window dressing. And window dressing is somebody that you hire so that your IPO or other analyst relations will look better, not because you expect him to do anything good for you. I don't recommend doing this, by the way. And the guy we hired for window dressing turned out to be a total disaster in any number of ways. Do you know who I'm talking about? OK, figured. All right. Oh, you don't know. So another example of what can happen, you can have a toxic person that you can't avoid bringing in because the alternatives are even worse. NetPOS was founded not too long before the internet bubble burst, which is when I and several other people I know lost our fortunes. And I had said, I'd actually said this several times out loud, this idea is so good, it'll be easy to get investors, and even if it isn't, I can fund it all out of pocket. OK, well, after the crash, both of those things were false. And we came quite close to having to shut down for lack of funds. And we ended up bringing in someone who provided some funds and some other resources and was more or less running the business for several years. And he turned out to be a congenital liar and not trustworthy for anything. And I mention this mostly because we had no choice. And I had this feeling, meeting this guy, that that might be the case. But there was no choice. And whereas you can decide not to start a company if you don't have the right people, by the time you've got investors, you have an obligation to do anything you can to keep it going. And in this case, it was a deal with the devil. So expect betrayals. This was a real eye-opener for me because I tend to assume the best about people. And I still assume the best about people because the vast majority of people will meet your expectations in that regard. But you have to know that some of these people who are newly met, that you are assuming the best about, are going to stab you in the back. And it's just the way it works. And it tends to be worse, in my experience, when you're dealing with large corporations. Because the legal fiction that a corporation is a person notwithstanding, corporations don't really have senses of guilt. They don't really have binding ethics. They are loose amalgamations of a number of forces. So just to give you an idea, First Virtual in its early days got some really blue chip investors. We had First USA Bank, we had First Data, we had GE Capital. Who am I missing? That's OK. Those were the big ones. And then one day, Visa came to us, and they were interested. Well, you don't say no if Visa wants to invest, right? So they sent an army of people to do due diligence, more than anyone I've ever seen in due diligence outside of IBM, where they literally send an army. And for several days, basically the company was just paralyzed, giving them documents, explaining things, so on and so forth. And then they all disappeared. And I think it was 2 days later, Visa made an announcement. And their announcement was that they were waiving all consumer liability for any credit card use on the internet. You know, we never thought they'd take that risk. That is such a big risk. And so it undercut our business model overnight. You know, there was no way our business model could work. And we had to start working very fast on changing business models, which we did. Being flexible. We all know that it's important to be flexible, at least in theory. You have to get in the habit of being it even with the little things, or you're not going to be able to do it with the big things. When Visa destroyed our business model, not everybody at the company knew that had happened. And it wasn't particularly in our interest to tell everybody, oh, by the way, our business model was just destroyed. If they hadn't noticed, there was no great reason to tell them. But we started immediately trying to figure out another business model. There was no choice, and we knew that sometimes you had to just change directions. The best attitude I ever saw about this came from a fellow who was our chief operating officer, who hated me. He was a former admiral in the Navy, and I was, when he was running all the logistics for the Gulf War, I was out protesting every day. So we had a few conflicts of values. But he said something that's really stuck with me. He said, I make hundreds of decisions every day. That's what an executive does. If I'm right on 95% of them, that's great. So I have to assume that 5% of my decisions are wrong, and I have to be prepared to reverse them when it's pointed out to me. I think that's a really good attitude. The more you are in charge of multiple things and making multiple decisions, the less likely you are to be able to always decide the right thing. And with luck, the flexibility, even when it has bad consequences, like I mentioned NetPOS bringing in this guy, it also can have side effects that are helpful, like getting to know much, much more about your customers. You probably think that the reason you become an entrepreneur is to be successful. As I'll explain in a minute, that's not necessarily the best reason. But if you're good at what you do and you provide a useful product and so on, there's a chance that you will become successful and you will start to have more money than you're used to having. This has some downsides that are worth anticipating. The first is you may never be able to fully trust a new friend again, because you'll never know whether they would be reacting to you the same way if you didn't have the money. I got to experience that in two ways when I made a fortune and then lost it. See who came around and then who left. So neglecting your friends while you're trying to build this company is a really big mistake, because the friends you have before that IPO or before that acquisitions, you're always going to be able to trust them more than any friends you make later. Nearly always. Another thing is, people fantasize about what they'll do when they become rich. And that's wonderful. It's fun. Fantasies are great. It's actually, people sometimes feel guilty, I'm spending too much time fantasizing about what I'll do when I become rich. Actually, you should be planning what you do if you become rich, because there are going to be all sorts of possibilities that open up, and if you don't have some idea of what your priorities are, you'll be jerked in every direction and quite possibly make choices you'll regret. I came this close, when I still had money, to buying a used 737 airplane and mounting it on a 60-foot tower over the woods near my house and turning it into an extra set of bedrooms. I live way out in the boondocks of northern Michigan. And if I had done that, I'd be really embarrassed by it. Fortunately, I lost all my fortune before I could do that. That was good luck. But you'll have an opportunity to do all sorts of indulgences, to give to charities that you've always wanted to help more. You'll have the chance to help relatives, which was a big one for me. And no matter how much money you make, it probably won't be enough to do all of these things. And thinking about it in advance, talking with your spouse or whatever, having a plan will serve you very well when everybody's knocking on your door offering you financial services and this and that because your name was on an IPO. So you need to make some real plans. And if there's one piece of advice I wish I'd listened to before all this, when you consult experts about how to handle your financials, do what you're paying them to tell you to do. I did not. Enough said about that. But you will find, as I said, that people treat you very differently. I was kind of astonished. I was almost 40. I was 39 when my company went public. And this is what I looked like, ordinary geeky guy. And the day after the IPO, I wake up, and everyone clearly now sees me more like this. I was, it was an interesting experience. And if you don't expect it, it can have some nasty consequences, most of which I dodged. So all the religions of mankind can't be wrong. Okay? Money is not the center of the universe. Money is not going to solve all your problems. There have been studies, which some of you probably know about, that show that above a certain level of income, making more money doesn't make you happier. And I completely believe that, although I do believe that losing that money makes you unhappier. So for me, getting rich, that was nice. Losing it all, that was horrendous. Mostly because I had to cut off relatives I was supporting and stuff like that. I mean, that was painful. But anyway, don't expect too much from money. The month of the IPO, my mother was diagnosed with colon cancer. And my money did not help at all. It was like somebody was giving me an object lesson, slapping me, saying, "You want to be rich? Look how useful it is." The only good thing about it was that my mother got to see me get rich. So you need another motive. Now I have the Bitcoin icon here because I think that most people who are involved in the Bitcoin project are not in it for the money. They're in it for some ideological reason related to the evils of government or something like that. And so they're working on this technology, and they may make some money, they may not, but they're on a crusade. I also believe that the people at the core of this, the mysterious guy who wrote it and so on, they may be motivated by money, but that's another story. So a lot of people who go on and do really good things are motivated by helping the world in various ways, like promoting open source projects that benefit the world and so on. And that's a better reason than money, I think, to found a business and to put in the ridiculous amount of work. But the best reason is having a good time. If your startup isn't a good time, you're doing it wrong, or you shouldn't be there. Be prepared to take bullets. Sometimes you'll be in the middle of months and months of various attempts at persuading either customers or the press or somebody else of something that you really, really believe. And you can you can wake up someday and find you have lost your argument. You may still believe in your argument, but you have lost it. And you have to recognize that fast enough to move on, lest you become irrelevant. I'm sure Mark knows what I'm referring to here too, but we firmly believed at First Virtual that sending credit card numbers over the net was very dangerous. And we predicted that if that became a common thing, the only way you'd even be able to tell that there was more fraud going on would be that the overall fraud rate in credit cards was going up. Well, it's been doing that for 15 years. So it was probably correct, but it turned out not to matter because Visa thought it was more important to control the market than to keep a lid on fraud. But anyway, at one point, we decided to try to prove how wrong this was. And we wrote a program that we called the Card Shark. And this was a program that sat on your PC anonymously, presumably it had been planted there by a virus or something, and watched your keystrokes. And it turns out a credit card number is the easiest thing in the world to recognize. Not only is it just 16 digits, but the first 15 determine what the 16th has to be. So you can absolutely know that's a credit card number. And so we wrote this program that waited until you typed a credit card number and then put some scary thing up on the screen. Right? And we were just trying to make a point. We were absolutely pilloried in the press. Simultaneously, for the dangerousness of what we had built and for the fact that we hadn't built anything new and were claiming it was new. In fact, we weren't claiming it was new, but saying that over and over did not help. Build the right team. I've seen quite a few companies where the founders and leaders have believed that they understand what's needed so completely that they don't need to look at conventional org charts or anything like that. They can make up their own. Huge mistake. Huge mistake. Because what almost certainly happens is that you discount the things you know the least about, which are the things you need most. So the classic example, and I'm talking to you guys in the back row, is a bunch of technical people founding a company and not putting enough into the marketing department or the sales department. Be ruthlessly clear-headed. You will find yourself as an entrepreneur saying things that hopefully you believe are true, but that are highly shaded to the version of the truth that you want the world to believe. And in my book, as long as it's true, that's not particularly unethical. The problem is, even if you're saying true things, the shading you're giving it that you're trying to get everybody else to believe isn't necessarily what you should believe. So the summary of that is don't believe your own press releases. Okay? You're putting such a positive spin on it that you can forget about all the problems you actually have. Another aspect of being clear-headed is worrying about the things that you don't want to worry about. So when I joined Mimecast, one of the reasons they hired me, aside from the fact that they liked the idea of having the guy who invented mime in the company, because of the name, was I had scared the pants off them talking to them about software patents. Because they believed, as I believe, that software patents were terribly evil, and they wanted nothing to do with them. And unfortunately, you can't just go on in that assumption because other people will go after you. You need to be able to defend yourself somehow. And so I came in and have been working on patents a lot for the last 3 years, which is great fun. Google made the same mistake. Google, with its "Don't be evil" motto, which they have officially given up, you know. So be evil now and then, I guess, is their motto. Google felt that patents were evil, so they didn't pursue them for many years. Well, as you all know, Google's been in a few patent battles in recent years. It spent something like $20 billion, was it, to acquire Motorola, which was entirely for the patents. And it spent a whole lot more, spent billions more on defending itself against Apple. And that was all from trying to do what they thought was not evil. And in fact, you know, is losing $20 billion of value for your shareholders not evil? You know, maybe that was more evil. It's never as clear as they made it sound like. So don't make promises you can't keep in that regard. When you make a promise as general as "don't be evil," well, unless you believe morality is always totally cut and dried, you're going to end up betraying it. Know your priorities. Your kids are only going to be young ones. Even the best of marriages is vulnerable to a sufficient amount of neglect and abuse from a startup company. And that stuff matters much more than anything you can do in your company. I've known quite a few people whose basically their IPO and their divorce happened around the same time, and you'd think, great, right? No, that was not their perception of it at all. They perceived that they never knew who to trust again, you know, because that person was someone who loved them when they were poor. These other people, will they still love you if you aren't poor? So I can't emphasize that too much. Behave impeccably. This I'm going to give you is basically bad advice, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. I'll explain why it's bad advice in a moment. Respect the other companies and people you do business with, and try to go the extra mile to make sure that that respect is both real and visible. When at First Virtual, we started out working with EDS on the technical side of our processing. And sorry about that, folks. Pause here. And EDS wanted us to work as a banking partner, First USA Bank, which we ended up doing. You know what story I'm telling, yes. And this was a big meeting that was being set up where the First USA top brass were going to be introduced to the founders of First Virtual. And I told you I never wore a suit in the 70s. I hardly ever wore one in the 80s either. And this was one of the 3 occasions at First Virtual where I wore a suit in the 5 years. And so I said to my partner, do you want me to wear a suit? And he said, if you don't mind. And we showed up, and all of the internet guys, me and Marshall Rose and our partners, were in very nice business suits. And the First USA guys were in jeans and T-shirts and flannel shirts. And in both cases, it was a gesture of respect, and it was instantly effective. You know, both sides knew instantly what had happened and what it meant, and we got along great with those guys pretty much the whole time. Although I spent much too much time in their building. The reason I say this is bad advice is that people won't always behave as well as you are. I mentioned that before. And they are going to, well, they're going to stab you in the back. But you should behave this way because it's better for your soul. Because when all is said and done, whether you're successful or not, you will be able to hold your head relatively high. I'm not going to name any names on this one, but I had a little thing that I did in the early days of First Virtual. When I met someone new that I might be doing business with, I would ask him, I say, well, some stuff I want to talk about, but I'd like to do it under non-disclosure. Are you willing to sign a non-disclosure? And they'd almost always say yes. And I'd say, great, we'll sign a non-disclosure later and we'll talk about it. And then a little later in the conversation, I'd say, well, you know, if you'll promise you'll sign the non-disclosure, I'll tell you now. And then I would tell them something unimportant. And I would wait and see whether they signed the non-disclosure afterwards. And in the whole time they did that, I did that, one person went back on it and didn't sign. And he is now one of the richest men in Silicon Valley. And I'm not at all sure that's a coincidence. So that's why I say it's bad advice. Behave unethically and you'll be like him. Accept help from anywhere. This is something that I had a problem with early in my career, because help can come from anywhere. And I'm not saying, you know, use the tarot deck to find out what to do next, but sometimes people who you absolutely don't expect will somehow give you a brilliant idea. And the way I like to think of it, although it's not very kind, is you're dealing with a preschool full of little children who are not very rational. And one of them starts to cry. He can't necessarily tell you why he's crying, but you know that something's wrong. And that's the way suggestions from bizarre people are, sort of. You know, they come out of left. You can't imagine why they thought of that, or how they thought of that, or why they should be the kind of person who can give you advice in business. You know, that's unnecessary and destructive pride. These ideas can come from anywhere. An interesting example that happened at Carnegie Mellon, not in any of my startups. I was working on a project called the Andrew Project. My whole life is lined up in this room. Doug was a part of that, a major force behind it. And one of the people working on it was building this networked window manager, like the X window system, only earlier. And this was James Gosling, who went on to do Java and a lot of other good stuff. And people were giving pushback that this window system, yeah, it worked, but it was ugly. And so the head of the project, Jim Morris, asked a professor from the art department to come in and look at it and see if he could figure out what was necessary to make it not ugly. And Gosling said he was a little nervous what was going to come out of all this, but, you know, what could he do? And he said he would walk by for like a week. He'd walk by this office, and the art professor would be just staring at the screen like this. And every now and then he'd write something down, stare at the screen, write something down. And finally he came to Gosling with his suggestion. He only had one. And his suggestion after all that was to increase the amount of space between the windows. And he did it, and everybody liked it better. You know, that was a kind of knowledge that was totally inscrutable to him and me. But you know, he recognized that this guy knew more about visual art than he ever would. And for me, it was a lesson that I carried forward. Well, I'm colorblind. So I learned very early, when we got our first color monitor, which was fairly late in the process, I realized I probably shouldn't choose the colors. Because when I tuned a TV set, they used to, oh, you guys don't remember, but it used to be you could tune the color on a TV set to try to get it right. And if I did that, people would run screaming from the room. You know, it was so horrendous. So, you know, I would bring in somebody to advise me on colors, and they immediately started giving me all sorts of other advice about the visual aspects of the program. It was a tremendous value that I might not have been humble enough to go for if I hadn't been colorblind in this case. But recognizing your own limitations, I think, is a little more generalizable. I suggest that you keep at it until you can pay it forward. I think that's the real goal here. The goal is not to get rich. The goal is not to be famous. At least I hope it isn't, because I don't think that's as good a path to a happy life. I think the real goal is to get to the point where you can be helpful to the next generation that's trying to do something interesting. For example, one of the 4 founders of First Virtual was a man named Einar Stefferud. Everybody called him Steph. And he was one of the grand old men of the internet. He started the first mailing list, first email mailing list. He used to tell people that his address was Steph at any machine on the ARPANET, which no one will ever make that claim again. And by the time we founded First Virtual, he was basically at the end of his career. He was like 65. And so he came in. He had been a mentor to two of the founders. And he came in and basically pontificated. that was his job, was pontificating, and occasionally talking to a reporter or something. First of all, it was incredibly valuable. It was really useful as we brought in younger people for them to see this, this pioneer who could explain the history of things. And I think for him, it was the culmination of a career that his whole career was leading up to that. You know, he had done all these things. By this point, he was old enough. He wasn't going to write any cool programs. You know, he wasn't really going to found a company except with three guys like us. But he was able to inspire the rest of us. And I think that's really your goal, is to end up like him.